Back. I just saw.
Good. But you can lead us.
I'm
till we
happy to
get
kick.
the leader.
I'm happy to kick you off. I'm not technically a member of the Finance Committee, and I'm also not in a great place to converse, but I can at least call you to order if that's helpful, and then let you nominate someone for chair. Then know you have a volunteer. So how about I call us to order at 3:04, and maybe I'll just call who I see on the screen for roll call, just so folks know who's here that's on the finance subcommittee, and then I'll turn it over to one of you. So Mike, you're actually at the top of my screen.
Hi, Mike Licklider. I'm the superintendent from the Harwood Unified Union School District, and I'm representing the Vermont Superintendents Association.
Thanks. And Elizabeth?
I'm Elizabeth Jennings. I'm the Director of Finance and Operations for Addison Northwest School District, and I'm representing the Vermont Association of School Business Officials.
Emily?
Hi, I'm Emily Kornheiser. I'm State Representative from Brattleboro, and I'm here as the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee.
Nicole?
Hi, Nicole Mace. I'm a school board trustee and for the Winooski School District, and I'm here representing the Vermont School Boards Association.
Zoe?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Zoe Saunders, Interim Secretary of Education, and I've invited several of our subject matter experts across finance, program, and district quality to be part of the conversation as needed for today.
Zoe. Anne?
Hi, I'm Ann Cummings. I chair Senate Finance, and let's hear who I'm representing, the Senate.
And I think you all said Craig is here. I can't see him on my small screen.
I am here. Yeah, Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner, representing the Tax Department.
Great, thanks. I think I will, so just for clarity for folks on the call, this is a subcommittee of the commission. It is a committee with an external member, and this is their first meeting. So they are gonna talk about having a chair, which in this context is really just to move the conversation forward, organize and kind of facilitate. So can I have nominations for a chair?
I will nominate Emily Kornheiser because her committee has done the heavy lifting, at least in the legislature, on ed finance, the system, and possible changes.
Thanks, Anne. Do I have a second? I'll do that first.
I'd be glad to second that nomination.
Thanks, Mike. Do I have any other nominations? Seeing none. All those in favor of, actually, I should say, is any discussion? Nope. Okay. Emily, are you good to go if committee?
Yes, I'm happy to consent. Thank you for the honor of leading this working group. I look forward to whatever we're going to do over the next few months.
Great. All those in favor?
Yes.
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 Aye.
Any abstentions or nays? Okay, hearing none, we don't need to do roll call. I will turn it over to Emily, and then I will happily turn my camera off. I am here and listening just to be able to connect to the work, but I'll probably turn my camera off.
Okay, Megan, before you leave, we've been doing public comment time for the committee and the steering. Is that something that is expected of all these subcommittees also?
It's on the agenda.
Okay.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you so much for helping us get kicked off, Megan. So this is our first meeting. Really glad to be here with all of you. I am not, I don't spend most of my time in Teams. I spend a little more of my time in Zoom. It's really a reason to make something a legislative committee and not an administrative committee, but I'm going to do the best I can here. I feel a little disoriented. And so just please bear with me. So we have an agenda in front of us we got through subcommittee leadership, and then we're going to hear from the public. We're going to do the subcommittee's charge and work plan for a little bit, plan for future meetings, again, hear from the public, and then adjourn. For future agenda setting, I'd love to do a little bit of that sort of at the end of each meeting, and then ask folks to be in touch with me if you have agenda items in the interim between meetings. In terms of meeting norms, I'd love for us to raise our little hands before we speak, especially given that there are, I think, a bunch of folks in the audience, and it'll just keep us rolling well. If that works for folks, feel free to use your physical hand if you can't find your digital hand. Are there other pieces of housekeeping that would be helpful for us to, you all have been working together. I'm the only non-commission member. So if you've established other norms as a group, I'm happy to adjust to them or hear them if I'm missing anything. Okay. And we're not streaming, we're just recording. Is that how this has been working so far? Okay. Go
I
ahead.
just wanted to reiterate, Senator Cummings had talked about folks turning their cameras off. I think that's been really helpful for these meetings. But if you're not a member of the committee, that the camera's off unless you're speaking during public comment.
Great. And then the idea is that if folks want to sort of be following this live, they're joining into the Teams meeting rather than waiting until the recording. Okay. Great. That is helpful. And then the controls of the meeting, who do those sit with?
That would be me, or if you're talking about
Okay.
unmuting, muting, this
Yeah.
is Maureen, the AD of
Okay.
the Agency of Education.
Thanks, Maureen. That is helpful to know. Okay. With that, it sounds like we should move into hearing from the public, ask folks to raise their hands if they're interested in testifying right now. Great. John Clifford, you are up.
Can you hear me all right?
I can. I'm gonna time you at 3 minutes, John, to make sure to just sort of set a norm and make sure that we have time for the meeting. If we need to adjust that in the future, we will.
Okay. Well, I started digging into myself. Education. Can you hear me? Okay. How education funding works about a year ago with the actions of our school board started to impact our property taxes. I wanted to educate our community as best I could because I didn't think education was a top priority. I went back to the original UVM report and Vermont Supreme Court decision through all the acts and documents and so on and so forth. As a retired person, I stopped reading fiction and started reading whatever this is. In May, I requested from our school district office, Champlain Valley School District, using the Freedom of Information Act, a list of all employees, their salaries, their date of hire, their school, and their position assignments. Honestly, 11 pages of spreadsheets on salaries ranging from 20,000 to 190,000. Principals, directors, professionals, staff, food service, you name it, union support, non-union. It took my breath away, and I kept thinking, how can a town our size afford this? Heinsberg has a town budget of 5.4 million, serving 4,700 residents. Indeed, as turns out, the biggest industry in Heinsberg is education. To put it in perspective for you, CVSD is the largest in Vermont with 907 employees, 254 teachers, 653 staff, serving 3,600 students in 5 towns with a population of 27,224 residents and 2,000 households. CVSD consolidated in July of 2017 with an initial budget of 75 million, serving 4,000 students. In 2024, CVSD requested 105.8 million. That's an increase. That would have raised property taxes by 30%. The voters rejected that. The district lowered that number to 101.8 million, finding 4 million in savings, which the voters approved on their second try. The question for me was, what accounted for the 25 million in spending over those 7 years?
And I'm going to ask you to wrap up. I'm sorry. Not, you don't have to stop talking right now, but just ask you to move towards your conclusion.
Despite what finance experts told us in 2017, consolidation did in fact not save us money. The per pupil spending in CVSD is more than 28,000 a student. CVSD has over 147 teachers and administrators earning over $100,000 a year. The annual budget for those 147 alone would be 34 million, not including benefits. I looked at one school in our community, Shelburne Community School, with 169 employees, 97 non-teaching staff, 738 students K through 8, 72 teachers, 25 paraeducators, 16 special ed teachers, 3 principals, 3 school counselors, 2 psychologists, 2 social workers, 1 physical therapist with a student teacher ratio of 10.25 to 1. The average
John. Hi, I don't want to cut you off mid-sentence, but we haven't even begun our work, and so it's hard. I want to make sure that we have time to do what we need to do. If you have a lot more, you're welcome to email it to all of us or to Maureen, and she can share it with all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you doing all of that research. I'm curious to dive into it. Would anyone else from the public like to participate today? Okay. Thank you. Sometimes I think, I don't know about the rest of you, that having sort of all that granularity about every single district in the state would be really helpful. And maybe that's one of the things that we can do here together. But it's hard to hear about just one district in isolation. So next up on our agenda is the subcommittee's charge and work plan. I think we're just beginning that process, but I wonder if there's someone from AOE that could read us that charge and has it in front of them. I don't know if that's one of the folks that you invited to the meeting today, Zoe.
Just wait one moment, please.
Great, thank you.
Just if it helps, Zoe, from the materials from the last commission meeting, the memo from the steering committee has the charge to the committee in it. I think on page 4, that's helpful. I can also share my screen. I don't know. I can't. I don't have authority, but
You can't share your screen.
That's one place.
Do we want to give Nicole the authority to share her screen, or are you pulling it up, Zoe?
Yeah, I can walk through.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So, yeah, absolutely. So this is also part of the agenda and is included within that. So the existence of the subcommittee and the steering group was required to form the subcommittee of the commission to address education finance topics in greater depth. Any decisions about formal recommendations will be acted upon by the full commission. The steering group discussed a proposed charge, which is to propose recommendations regarding cost containment strategies in the short term and the entire education finance system in the long term, so that the full commission can provide preliminary financial recommendations to the General Assembly by December 2024 and more formal recommendations by December 2025. And as we talked about with the larger committee, we talked about a broader working group work plan from the steering committee, and really thinking about that tension between the urgency around short-term recommendations while also planning for the long term.
And I guess I'm wondering, I've been assuming that we would create sort of a sub-work plan for this group with more granularity. Is that the understanding everyone else also had?
Yes, so
Okay.
part of the framework we established with the steering committee included that flexibility. So it outlined general phases to the work with the expectation that the subcommittees would provide more granularity and specificity on the specific timelines within their scope of work. So absolutely, that would be the expectation.
Okay, great. Are there pieces in that charge that feel unclear to folks that they want to discuss or have questions about? Okay. What feels clearest to me is that I actually still don't know what problem we're trying to solve. And I don't mean that casually or blithely. I mean, I've spent the majority of the last year of my life focused on this issue, and I actually still don't know what problem we're trying to solve. And so I see that there's sort of the short-term charge of cost containment. But even what that means, I think, is an open question. I appreciate you nodding, Nicole. Thank you. And so I think it would be really helpful to spend some time talking about what that problem is that we're trying to solve, or what questions we have that would help us figure out what problem we're trying to solve, and maybe try to get some of those questions answered in our next meeting. Does that sound helpful? Also wondering, Maureen, are you taking notes?
Yes.
Yes, the agency
Okay.
provides support, yeah, with our note taking.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Okay.
And the other thing I would offer is when we first met as a commission, we walked through some of the policy considerations in more detail, if that would be helpful. I'm not sure if I can share my screen, but I could ask Maureen to do that, and we could walk through that, which provides a little bit more specificity around the types of considerations that the Education Finance Subcommittee should explore. So if that would be helpful, we could also provide a deeper dive there.
Yeah, let's have Nicole, why don't you jump in with what you're going to say, and then Zoe, everyone's okay with first names in this meeting, right? Is that comfortable for
That's fine
everyone?
with me.
Great,
Yeah.
I love that. Okay. It's like still summerish. I really want to just keep my first name for a little bit while longer. Nicole, go ahead, and then maybe we can go to you, Zoe, to walk through that.
So I
Sounds
just
good.
wanted to offer, many of us have been having this conversation for a month at this point. But one of the conversations the steering committee had was around, establishing a baseline knowledge for those of us engaging in this work so that we can mutually agree upon the problem statement. Zoe and her team put together a great Vermont State education profile. So I think that should be required reading. But we also identified a list of data sets that are really specific to ed finance. I believe we're going to be able to draw on the support of some staff from the agency and potentially joint fiscal to provide that information to us. But I think that's going to be really important to start to get at those questions. What problem are we trying to solve to ensure we're all looking at the same information and have the same understanding. And we have that in a document somewhere. I'm also happy to share, or Zoe can share.
Oh, that is so little. Some rearranging of screens is needed. Okay, great. Go ahead.
I can read. Emily, would you like me to move forward?
Yeah,
with this?
please. Thank you.
Okay, great. So these are just some policy considerations that were called out in the law that I think will be helpful in guiding our work. So thinking about recommendations, overall our framing is around ensuring that our education system affords substantially equal access to a quality basic education. And so we provided some policy context to that when we did our first convening as a commission, which talks about allowable uses for the education fund, including impact of healthcare cost, the method for setting tax rates, and strengthening the understanding between budget votes and property tax. So we've had a lot of conversation around ensuring transparency around that relationship, and examining any adjustments to property tax credit thresholds. Another consideration is alternative funding models, including a formal base amount of per pupil education spending. An additional consideration from the law is adjustments to the excess spending threshold and spending caps with recommendations to target specific types of spending and services. And then subsequently, there will be a committee formed for the Education Fund Advisory Committee that will provide an ongoing monitoring system of the Education Fund and Vermont's finance system. Additional policy considerations were really categorized into these two buckets. One is looking at education governance, resources, and administration, and this is looking at the structure and needs of the agency of education, composition, role, and function of the State Board of Education, roles, functions, and decisions of local control versus state control, and integration of career and technical education. Another bucket of policy considerations revolves around the physical size and footprint of the education system. And there is alignment that is noted here with the School State Construction Aid Working Group. And so we've had some conversations around having intentionality around connecting those two working groups. And really the areas of inquiry here are related to identifying the most efficient and effective number and locations of school buildings, district, and supervisory unions, looking at workforce retention and capacity driven by class size data, looking at the town tuition program, including the role, designation, and tuitioning outside of Vermont, and the use of private therapeutic schools, including the legal and financial impact. Additional considerations include the role of the public school in both the provision of education and the social emotional well-being of students, and how public education should be delivered, what types of wraparound supports and collections of services are important, and looking at the strengths and opportunity of collaboration with post-secondary schools. There also was attention to identifying the consequences of recommendations related to staffing, funding, and any other affected systems. And then there is broad discretion for the steering committee to review any other, or this group and the committee to review any other considerations that would be important to informing our work. I will note that as part of what we've done to date, the Agency of Education, as Nicole has mentioned, put together, published last week, a state profile just to really ground our conversations and do some table setting around the current state. The intent is for us to do a deeper dive. A lot of that report was related to expenditure, and we recognize the need to have further analysis around the funding sources as well. And so that'll be part of subsequent reports. We also are working with our education leaders, our superintendents and principals around getting further clarity around how the budgets are built, and specifically what portion of the budget is spent on other what would be called wraparound or mental health supports. That is a little bit more of a complex process that requires some more engagement with the field, which we are currently in the process of gathering to have a better understanding of that policy consideration that was noted in the law. And I'm going to preview some of our other slides to see if there's anything else that is pertinent. The only other thing I might mention that was part of this overview presentation was that we do have resources available as a commission, including consulting services. So that would be something that we could consider as an education finance subcommittee if there would be consulting services that could be valuable for this committee's charge.
Thank you. What I saw in those slides is sort of all of the pieces of the system that we might be able to touch or not touch, but still not, it's sort of the parameters of the solution set is what was in those slides. And I still think the sort of defining of the problem set is in front of us. Very mathy of me to say it that way. So I wonder if we could, as hard as this is on Teams, actually just sort of have an open conversation for a few minutes about what the actual problem we're trying to solve is. Maybe would folks feel comfortable just taking turns and trying to define, and I would say like explicitly the problem of this we're a working group? Is that the? Okay.
Subcommittee.
Subcommittee? Subcommittee. Okay, the exact, how each of us on the subcommittee would define the problem that we were trying to solve in front of us. If that would be, does that feel comfortable to just go around and take turns on that? Okay. Who wants to go first? Thanks, Craig.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I mean, as tax commissioner, right, I think my focus is on, we have property tax growth that is unsustainable for many and a system that's very challenging for most to understand. So it's difficult, both to understand and solve the problem, but also engage with it for, I think, everyday Vermonters.
Anne, go ahead.
Okay, since my committee set up this committee, I'm just going to build on the tax commissioners. We, in the last few years, have seen what is an unsustainable amount of growth. We haven't really defined why that's happening, or if this is just an aberration and we'll go back to 3% a year, or if this is the new normal. We know that people right now cannot sustain the kind of property tax increase we've been seeing. There seems to be some concern that our at least national test scores are not where they should be, considering the amount of money that we're spending. And the structure is difficult to understand. But when we set it up, we were trying to do, I think, two things. One was beat the Brigham decision, which said the money had to be picked up and redistributed so that every child had equal access to the money, meaning basically that a penny on the tax rate raised the same amount per child in every town. I think we figured out that some towns can pay for a penny more easily than other towns, and that's brought up a whole new set of issues. But we also set up a system that maintained local control, that local voters determine how much they want to spend on their schools, and the state then pays for it, which in state government is a unique system. No other department of state government just says, this is what we need, and you are obliged to give it to us. The feedback they get is, this is what we have, live with it. And so that's also caused distress. And I think we're trying to grapple with that, with local versus state control, with cost versus ability to pay. We have an aging population. Our school age population has been declining for 20 years. And we're trying to, I think this year's increases was where we hit the wall and we said, wait a second, we can't sustain this forever. We're going to need to look at it and see what it will take to find a system that produces high quality education at a price that is sustainable. And I think that's the base problem, is maintaining quality, but also financial sustainability. We could always decide the present system is sustainable.
Mhm.
But I think that's the challenge.
Thanks. Who's up next?
I'll take a stab at it. I think it's really complicated and complex, which is why I think we've been having this conversation for well over a decade in Vermont. I think the problem statement that resulted in the creation of the commission was failure of school budgets, property tax pressure, sort of what Craig and Ann have alluded to. But that trend has been in existence for a long time. So we spend $2.3 billion in Vermont to educate 85,000 students. Our outcomes are not equitable. Our buildings are falling into disrepair. And we're getting the message that this is not sustainable. It's squeezing out the ability to fund other initiatives. So that's one piece. I think it is important that we look at what are the cost drivers in education that have made it very difficult to bend to correspond, have our cost line mirror in some way our demographic trends, because there's a disconnect. And I think the problem we have right now is the incentives at the local level are largely on the up pressure to spend more, and local officials don't have a lot of tools in their toolkit to bend that cost curve, because that involves really, really difficult decisions. And there's frankly not a lot of support from the state when those decisions get hard. And that's the dynamic I've seen play out, and I think we need to talk about that and work our way through it. Because just changing the funding formula is not going to change how hard those decisions are.
You're muted, Emily.
Elizabeth, you're next up.
Thank you. So I was going to go somewhere in between half of what I heard Ann say and half of what I heard Nicole say. But it kind of, as I listen to other people, kind of makes me think of other things as well. So I think, balancing that high quality education amongst a situation in many school districts where, as Nicole said, buildings are ailing, staffing, it may not be right sized, or it might be, and at an attainable, sustainable, affordable cost for all. That's the ultimate goal. But as Nicole was indicating, how complicated it is, especially when we think about the fact that it is inequitable amongst districts. And so one district might be having ailing buildings, another might actually have fixed up all of their buildings, but their cost per student are higher. Maybe their staffing is more available in certain areas of the state than others, and they can find certain resources for students that other areas are struggling to find. So having that affordable cost spread out amongst very different districts of different sizes and different locations is the most complicated part about the situation. So I think for all of us, trying to hone in on what those cost drivers are, it's not necessarily going to be the same cost driver in every district is the real trick to it. It's going to be different for a certain number of categories of districts together. We might have some commonality with maybe 10 other districts in my area or outside of my area, but we might be very different from someone who's across the state. So I think the data is what's really going to help us determine what those cost drivers are and how it's affecting different districts in a different way.
Thank you. Mike, you're up.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the conversation, and have to say that I think everyone's on target with some of the challenges we face. And so focusing on the challenges, I will say that I was at our high school this afternoon, and while we are talking about those challenges and necessary problems, it was helpful to me to spend some time with high school students who are in their second week of school and very happy. So I think it's an important point to note that we have students in the state who do very well, who are our primary mission right now, and that's why we're looking at some of the challenges. One of my other meetings today was over special education services, and I use that as an example because it illustrates another challenge. We're not just looking at issues of local and state control, but we're looking at some significant federal mandates. I think Act 173 and some of the work there that tried to reduce costs was a good reminder as well. that we have a lot of federally unfunded mandates, but they're really important elements to consider because we're providing some very necessary supports for students who have some challenges in their education. So I think that's another piece to the puzzle that we have to consider. And as a superintendent, my third piece today was a meeting talking about the budgeting season. And we are already starting our school budgeting season. One of our charges in the short term for this committee and the commission is to provide those short-term recommendations for cost containment. And I do think that from my perspective, this committee has a lot of important work to do in a very short amount of time because we talk about a December deadline, but really that December deadline is to have the recommendations out, which means our work really needs to move quickly so that we can have recommendations to the commission. And I'm thinking sometime in the November timeframe, but start to put those ideas out because by December, school districts, we have budgets that we're presenting to boards that are pretty well developed. So I think there's a lot of pressure on this committee, important pressure for our students, for our communities, and for our taxpayers.
Thanks. Zoe.
So I think the charge of this specific committee is to explore ways to redesign our education finance system to ensure access to substantially equal education for every student in a way that meets our current student needs and can be sustained through targeted structural changes and reinvestment strategies that support high quality education that's affordable. And I think to that end, in order to understand that, there are a couple of things that would be helpful for us to pull in terms of a data review. One, I think articulating those mandates, I think that's important, as Mike had mentioned. Looking at what is currently being allocated within the budgets in terms of how we're delivering education and what that consists of. Acknowledging right now that there is not a one size fits all, and I think there's a lot of value in us looking at the data and starting to compare similar districts and similar schools to identify best practices and models that could be replicated. And I also think there's a lot of rich information we can get from exploring how other states fund their education system and evaluating the feasibility of those methods being implemented here in Vermont to achieve our goals, high quality education that we can sustain over time.
Thanks. Am I the only one left? I am. Okay. I know that year-over-year property tax increases like this are not sustainable. That's like the one thing that I feel very clear in knowing. I don't know if we're spending too much money or we're just spending it in the wrong places. I think the districts, every time folks talk about spending too much money, I think of those districts in our state that are drastically underspending and what happens to the kids there. And I think a couple of you have mentioned that. So I really want to keep an eagle eye on that piece of the puzzle to make sure that we're not creating the wrong incentives to further sort of harm those communities. The other big problem I see us trying to solve, I don't know if the solution is more transparency or greater understanding of how, the tax system works. Like, we don't expect that of other pieces of our tax code. For me, the problem is that we've created a situation where no one feels really responsible for the decisions that are being made. And so it's very easy for us all to blame each other for the results of those decisions rather than sort of embracing what needs to happen next. And so that's one of the top problems I want to solve, is just sort of getting clear on zones of responsibility when making decisions about spending and budgeting. And I hope that we can keep questions of sort of revenue raising and spending somewhat separate from each other in our discussions, even though they're of course deeply integrated. Those are the big, in terms of timeline, I think that's also a problem we have to solve. The idea that we're going to come up with short-term solutions in the next month and a half that have not already been somehow like deeply explored is seems both necessary and absurd as a requirement, but we're going to push forward on it. And then the timeline of sort of the standard school budgeting year and how that fits into the legislative session is another big problem we have to solve. I think we need to solve it for this year. I also think it's one of the structural problems that we have in front of us that sort of creates the strange incentive system. Anyone want to add anything based on sort of what they heard other people say? I think for our next meeting, I'd be happy to write some of this up. Nicole, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to sort of reflect on something I've heard Anne say a few times during this process, that, you know, there are legislators who are hearing from their communities, we have to do something, we have to do something. And so, you know, there's an expectation that bills will be coming forward in January. And so I think there are a lot of folks out there that expect this process to be a total failure. And in my view, it's a really important opportunity for folks to get away from the pointing fingers and get the right, you know, we're only representatives, but we are sort of representative of the different actors here and try to talk through some reasonable first steps and then long-term steps. And so I think to Mike's point about the timeline, as sort of ambitious as that might be, you know, what I would hate to see is the December 1 letter come out, people start to panic, there's more fuel going into the legislative session, and we haven't given local officials any kind of tools to hold the line on things. And we're right back where we were last session.
I also hope that, or hope that doesn't happen, I guess I would say. Go ahead, Zoe.
I think something else that's going to be very important for us to consider is to put everything on the table, right? I mean, I think a lot of these ideas have been explored, and we've noted in many of our conversations that it's not one quick fix, right? And I think it's really important for us to be open-minded and really create a very comprehensive menu of options, even if some of those considerations have been looked at before, to really model what the impact would be so that we are coming to some concrete recommendations. And I think to do that, it is iterative. There may be some ideas that simply do not work, but I would hope that we don't prejudge those ideas and rather we spend time, maybe one of our first deliverables is to really create that comprehensive menu of options and begin to identify what we would need to learn about those options in order for them to be viable for our system. And then a second phase would actually begin to model what that implementation would look like. And I do think in that work, we have to be mindful of affordability and education quality and making sure that we're creating a balanced approach with that.
I appreciate that. And I want to name that it's really hard in a very public meeting to be creative and generative and brainstorm or even make a comprehensive list of past ideas. Because if you're the person bringing up the past idea, you must be the person who loves the past idea. And I agree that it's really important that we're able to do that. I think we've already named that if like this is a problem, if this was an easy problem to solve, it would have been solved already. We don't even know what the problem is, right? So any answer, any idea is going to have, you know, consequences to it and a variety of stakeholders that are not interested in that solution. I will say that I also think public participation is going to be a really important part of this. And I don't mean the 3 minutes when I cut someone off. I mean, you know, I personally knocked on a lot of doors this summer and had a lot of conversations with just individual Vermonters about education finance, which started with, here's the problem statement, and ended with, okay, well, like, if something's got to give, where do you think it should give? Like, where do you think change should happen? And I've asked a lot of my legislative colleagues to start having those conversations to really, like, what would it look like for sort of the majority of the state to consent to whatever these changes look like? And I hope that we, given that all of you are on the commission other than me, can seed some questions into your tour around the state to make sure that folks are really understanding what we're talking about. Because I think when we just hear from people when they don't know sort of what the decisions are on the table, can be a little counterproductive. Craig?
I have maybe just a logistical comment for the subcommittee. I think when the steering committee was talking about formation of this subcommittee, it thought that this was one of the ones that may want to make use of some of the funding that's available for outside consultants. And so I would just say, if we think as a subcommittee that that is a good idea, I think it's a topic we should discuss like early on in this process, because it'll have to go through the state procurement process through AOE, and that's not a fast process always. And so just again, talking about the tight timeline that we have, I think it'll be important to sort of understand the scope of work that we're looking for there, so that AOE can start that process and we can bring somebody on with enough time to add value to what we're doing.
Let's all plan on doing that at our next meeting. Nicole, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think we need to talk, I have had different understanding of the role of consultants for this committee. I had thought we were sort of leaning towards not having one for this committee, so I think it's worth a conversation around, do we need the support of a consultant, or is staff from the agency and JFO, like, just that conversation, what's the purpose of that? Because to your point earlier, Emily, there is a community engagement committee that has been identified, and I think that is another area where some consultant support might be very important and helpful to ensure we're having really robust, transparent engagement processes as part of this conversation. It's a statewide conversation. People need to both understand what the options are and have an opportunity to weigh in.
When you all talked about contracted support, was that a contracted facilitator or was it a contracted analytic support, or both?
On
Or
community
people like
engagement,
carrying
or
assumptions?
Yeah. You see my hand?
Yeah, go ahead, Anne.
I think for me, because my committee just looks at numbers, I have the sense that there's a lot of information out there, but I don't know what it is or where it is. And until I know what we have, I don't know what, if anything, more we need. And so until we do that base work and say, this is the data we have, then it's hard to say where the holes are. And do I need a consultant who's just got the time to develop more data? Or do I need a consultant to help interpret the data we have, or to help us think through other ways? Because there is a whole world out there that's educating and paying for educating their children. And I don't know that we know what they all are, or how they're nuanced. So I don't feel like I'm ready to decide if I need a consultant, because I need to know what we have in the way of data, and then say, okay, what do we need? And do we need more data, or do we need help in understanding what we have, how it interacts with each other.
Mike?
I would agree with Ann, and I do want to say that I think it was very helpful for me. Zoe and her team put together just an exceptional report on all the educational data, and I don't want to put work on others, but it would be helpful to me at least to see the education fund on the revenue and expense side and get some of those details, some of those data sets. I think Nicole at the beginning mentioned some information that the steering committee identified, but really for I think all of us to sit down together like we're having a conversation now to see that data presented at least from the 20,000 foot view and have that consistent understanding among this committee, and then as Ann said, to decide what those next steps need to be, but it probably needs to be very soon that we look at that information.
Okay, so I don't hear anyone being interested in a paid facilitator. I hear people talking that if we were going to get a consultant, it would be an data-based, it would be a data consultant, and we need to know more things before we know that. Zoe?
I was just gonna, sorry, I was just gonna offer that certainly as what we can do at the agency is share the information that we have, right? And that can be a report that we provide back to this committee. We are engaged in further analysis and we can bring that to you as well, even if it's not a complete report, but here are the other areas that we are looking to analyze as it relates to the education finance system. And that could be a helpful way to prioritize. I do think that after that conversation, we should have some discussions around additional support, because I think beyond the analytics, it's really starting to do more of the sophisticated modeling of really helping people understand what those implications would be in practice. That may be later down the road, but I do think that making this as tangible as possible is going to be really important for getting informed input from the public.
This is very much a housekeeping question. So you all are looking at certain data and conversations at the commission and at the steering committee. I'm the only one who is not there. I am happy to catch up in between meetings to see that. And I know that the public watches these meetings, various sort of iterations of the public. And part of sometimes these meetings is about sort of bringing your whole audience along with you. And so if we are not sort of, if we are assuming a certain degree of knowledge amongst ourselves, because I am catching up separate from your meetings, we might be leaving some members of our audience behind. Do we want, which is a fine thing to do if we're assuming that if someone's paying attention to this, they're also paying attention to the larger meetings. And so I wonder people's thoughts on that. And sorry, Nicole, you were going to say something about something else, but go ahead.
No, that's along the line. So I think I was envisioning, I know the money committees get an update on the Ed Fund Outlook, the sort of Julia Richter and Nicole Lee are very well versed at providing detailed information about Ed Fund sources and uses. And I think, so I don't know, Zoe, what you guys have planned on the Ed Finance piece, but I think for folks who do engage in these conversations, and I would put myself among the nerds and that do, like, it's really important to have that level of specificity in terms of the past 10 years of Ed Fund sources and uses. I'm also really interested in a breakdown of the $1.9 billion education payment to districts in terms of function and object. We can start to dig into sort of how we're spending the money. Is it instruction? Is it support services? Is it administration? Which may not be a data set that's easily consumable or appropriate for the kind of reports that you're doing. And so while I'm appreciative of the fact that you're doing that work, I also think this committee might have a distinct subset of needs that we might want to dive into that may be a little bit separate from that.
Thanks, agreed. Mike?
That was my understanding as well. Nicole, I think, expressed that really well. And the one piece I would add to it is I know the legislature, out of necessity and to help all of us school districts, used some one-time money in this last session, I think it would also be good to understand what that hole is that will have to be made up in the next session. I think it's critical for that baseline knowledge.
It's a really big hole, Mike, and we will talk about that next at our next meeting, Elizabeth.
Not as big as it could have been.
I just wanted to tack on to something Nicole was just talking about with regards to data and how we look at data. If we're using, and call myself a nerd also in regards to the finance, but when I think about financial reporting, even within my own district, I know that my board members, I have a different, crew of board members who like to see things one way and another crew that like to see things another way. And so when Nicole was talking, you were talking about like departmental, how much you're spending on administration, how much you're spending on direct instruction, things like that. That's important. But I also have a subset of people who like to see things in a different way, because a lot of people will see a number for administration and think that means, oh, that's staff. And that's not necessarily the case. It's the cost of administering the school district, not just staff, right? So I think looking at data in two different ways, departmental data that talks about in that manner, but also by almost like object code, as we call it, salaries, benefits, professional services, transportation, so those kind of subsets, it's very different than looking at it by department and what type of service it is. It's looking at how much are you paying in salaries, how much are you paying for your personnel, and then how much you're paying for contracted services and other things. Supplies is probably the least of, anybody's budget and what they're spending their money on. So I just think it would be interesting to see the two different ways of looking at the data.
Appreciate that. Zoe, go ahead.
I think much of the data you're asking for, the Agency of Education is able to provide. I think it would be helpful to start with, here's what we have, and there's different ways to present that. And I think that's kind of the conversation we're having at this point. Where there's data that we may not have is where we're working with the field to bridge that gap. So as part of the agency's Listen and Learn tour, we are working really closely with our education leaders, including superintendents, principals, business managers, to collect additional data so we have visibility at a more refined level to this type of spending in the school budget. So I think it might be helpful for us to bring forward a view of the information that we can supply at the next meeting, and then get feedback on what additional information would be helpful to guide this committee's work. From there, we can investigate if we have access to it, and if we don't, how we can work with the field to make sure we can have a data collection to get that more refined visibility. But if you'd like, I could, if Nicole Lee on our team, who is our expert in education finance, has anything to add, I would invite her to come on the screen and share any additional details she may have or want to offer.
Before Nicole jumps in, Anne, I see your hand.
Okay. I think some of us saw a presentation by the department on the data that's available, and it was amazing how much data we have as to what things get spent on. I think what we didn't have time to really figure out is it that percentage across the board, or do different districts spend different amounts, and what's the impact on the cost and on the quality? We have, I'm told, some schools that are fairly low cost and produce good results, and so how do they do it? And that kind of analysis may be where we need some help, just because the sheer amount of data out there is overwhelming, I think. But
So how about for our next meeting, I'm happy to work with AOE and tax to put together like a pretty significant presentation. If folks have specific questions that they want to email me that I can funnel through in advance, and we can do that. And then I'm sure we'll have lots more questions that come up as we're looking at the data that we can then figure out how best to access it. Zoe, is Nicole here? Does she want to jump on?
She is here, and I'll just mention a couple things before she may want to add more. In the first report that we did provide, we started to analyze school districts that were higher performing and higher spending versus higher performing and lower spending. And so we have a quadrant that kind of helps us compare spending and performance with an overlay around need using a poverty indicator. So that's just one first view to begin having that conversation that I think is useful. And as we move forward, we're looking at that more regionally, and also to Senator Cummings' point, understanding kind of similarities, right? So that we can learn from best practices for those schools that may be similar sized, serving a similar demographic, but may have more financial viability. What are some of the practices that may be in place? Or they might have higher performance, and what are some of the strategies that are being deployed? So part of what we're trying to do with the Listen and Learn tour is use this data to engage in those conversations with the field so that we can really begin to capture those best practices to share and inform broader policy considerations. But I would open it up for Nicole if you have anything else to add to the current data that we have available and could bring forward.
And I just want to add, so Larry Pikus did a pretty comprehensive study about a decade ago, not the one about appropriate spending, but actually one of that was sort of more focused on best practices and what made a successful school in Vermont. And so it sounds like you're somewhat updated. Appropriate spending. Hey, it's so nice to see you.
Okay.
Hi, sorry, my video cut out. So if I'm cutting someone off, just tell me. All I want to add is that as data requests come up or you want to know about a specific topic, I would ask however is appropriate we're going to need a pretty high level of granularity in those asks, because we don't just track mental health. There's no like button someone can push in their general ledger at a school that defines mental health. There's no button someone can push that picks out the drivers from an analytics system. And so we can collect data. Some we do have, some we don't. For those legislators on this call, there are times I come and say, we don't have that. But we've got to get to some granularity, because what was really hard this past year and continues to be hard is these drivers are big topics, and that's great. And we need to define them and spend that time. But an object or a function or the uniform chart of accounts guides a lot of how things are coded in the state of Vermont, and we need to lean into that more. I think that's actually what Senator Cummings is talking about. And so I'm sort of like coming to you with a plea of specificity as you're looking for different pieces of data.
And I would add to that the timing is important, right? Because some of this we actually need to engage with the field to collect and get some additional information. And so it's important for us to really, work with you on prioritizing some of that as we're engaging in these planning sessions and designing some additional data collection tools.
Go ahead, Nicole.
So I think that's what Elizabeth and I were also talking about in terms of object and function. So if we have a breakdown of district budgets, which we won't necessarily have good info, the agency won't have for the current fiscal year, but the stat books were due last month from my general traumatized memory of being a business manager. So so I guess, Nicole, are you asking for us to tell you what functions or objects, or just I think a high level report on district budgets by object and function? I guess that's we probably need to get our act together in terms of giving you better guidance around what would be helpful for us. But I think that's where I'm going to, like, we need to take advantage of the fact that we have a uniform chart of accounts, because the whole purpose of that was to be able to compare.
Yeah, and object and function is great. It may be iterative as well, right? So if someone asks me for a type of expense, I'll be honest, I often go to Elizabeth and the school business officials to say, how do people generally code this? To be able to understand and then draw from stat book data, or if we've collected budget data, which is limited, but I hear both of you and I appreciate that. And I just wanted to say it out loud as well, that there are oftentimes I don't have enough information to then pick what people are looking for, or I have to make a lot of assumptions, and I don't really want to do that in this case.
Very appreciated. Thank you. Jill, I see that you joined us, and then I think
Sure.
Anne wants to say something.
Yeah, and I was just going to build a bit on what Nicole said. We've had some good success partnering with our expert business managers in the field when we do need to identify something like a broad bucket, like mental health supports, right? So we work with them. What are the object and function codes? I was also going to make a suggestion, because this is something that has tripped us up recently as we were putting together our state profile report, is having a shared definition of what we mean when we say spending. Because do we mean actuals, which comes, as Nicole and Elizabeth know, out of our stat book, or do we mean budgets, which is going to be Nicole's shop and probably as much less granularity? And I think that that shared set of definitions moving forward will likely save you all some heartache and cross lines. So a suggestion.
Thank you, Jill. Yes, to all those things. I think the other, oh, sorry, Anne, you were going to go next and then I
No,
jumped in. Go ahead.
I just want to say, I hope staff will not hesitate to speak back to us, because we don't know what we don't know, and we all speak our own individual language on our own. But you start talking about objects and function, and I've got a totally different interpretation in my world as to what that is as to a business manager. So I think for this to work, we're all going to not be able to hesitate to say, I don't know what that means. I have no idea what you're talking about, and be able to communicate, because I think we can all learn from each other a lot better if the communications are open, and if no ideas are not allowed, that all ideas have to be free to be put on the table, even if they're unpopular with some people, because they can change and become less unpopular. But we've got to have that open flow of ideas and data, or we're just going to be another committee that gets stuck on the shelf and goes nowhere.
Agreed. So one thing I'd love for Jill and Nicole to do some thinking about, Nicole Lee, to do some thinking about, but I guess all of us, is statewide trend over 10 years is interesting. What's more interesting is if actually that entire trend is being driven by the top 10% spending districts, or the bottom top 10% spending districts, or the 10 poorest districts, or the 10 most rural districts. I don't know, but what the why is going to get entirely lost if we're just looking at sums. And so thinking about how we might want to, and I understand that might be why we would want a consultant, but I like to begin to think about what it's going to take to do some coding to be able to do some cross-referencing. Might be helpful.
Emily,
that's-
can I ask
Yes,
you
go
to,
ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say,
Go ahead, Jill.
I happen to be answering an email from our consultant right now. So We have some available resources right now. Emily, can I ask you to say it one more time? So if we're thinking about, are we thinking about drivers or outliers in increase in total expenditures? And then we may want to crosswalk it with something like enrollment trends or FRL, like so, there needs to be other contextualizing. Okay, if you can help Nicole and I think about what that looks like, and we can do some noodling as well. I think that Zoe, I'm gonna speak on this only because I'm literally answering the email. I think that's very much in alignment with our next round of reporting that we're doing for Listen and Learn. So I think we can probably really drive this work forward in a really useful way for both groups.
Yeah, and I was agree with that. That's exactly where we are. This first report was really looking at the highest level of SUs to identify statewide trends. This next phase is where we're going to really be able to either, we're going to be intentional around how we group. So definitely I'm open to recommendations on how to do that, but looking at, by region, by similar demographics, by spending, so that we can call out those patterns and trends and understand how they're influencing the overall statewide movement. So I think we could have some further conversation, but we're primed to be engaging in that work. In this first report, we were doing analysis by the size of the SU. And so we've captured some additional categories that will be needed beyond size, which would include some of the community demographics, spending patterns and things of that nature, so that we begin to develop profiles around how education finance and education delivery is organized across the state. So definitely welcome to input on that. I think we're primed to engage in that analysis now.
Great. Oh, very exciting. Mike, I think you're going to have the last word on this topic, and then we're going to go into logistics.
Great. And just as a reminder, the School Business Officials, School Board Association, and Superintendents Association put out a really good resource, 12-page resource on some of those cost drivers to consider for this year's budget. So I would just encourage everyone to take a look at that resource as well.
Was that the one from March, April, sometime in there? Or is that more recent?
This one was just put out in August. I can email it to, if you let me to. Yeah,
I think I missed that. I would love that. Yeah. Thank you.
Too.
Okay. Let's go into scheduling, everyone's very favorite part of any meeting. I have heard a rumor that Mondays are when such things happen. That's been officially declared. Okay.
Just the full commission.
Yes.
But we're supposed to be done before the legislative session.
And so full commissions on Mondays, steering committees on Mondays, ideally working groups would also be happening on Mondays. Which Mondays are still available?
I'll defer to Zoe and her team on that because I don't know that I have out meetings scheduled yet.
I'm going to ask Maureen if she could weigh in, because she has really been helping all of us schedule everything for the commission. Okay. Maureen, can you give us some guidance?
Yeah, I'm thinking that the full commission is meeting the third Monday of every month, and I don't think the steering group has landed on a cadence yet. Okay. I'll double check that, but that's what I'm thinking.
So do we want to call fourth Mondays, and then that would mean we could have a second meeting in September?
Can I also just add that I think the commission's meeting in the afternoons, so
okay,
that would leave mornings open.
Can I suggest, Emily, that you coordinate with Megan Roy, because I think she is trying to keep the pace. Okay. So she might have a sense of what that looks like and what other, I know there's another committee, the Community Engagement Committee. So just, I don't think any of us are on that one, but.
I would also love to meet in person. Is that bonkers?
I love meeting at the Department of Ed. I just have to cross the street.
That's so nice for you, Anne.
We'd love to host, yes.
I'd prefer in person.
Yeah, I would too. Emily, you're the one that's.
I know, I'm the one with the drive, but this is. Elizabeth, are you okay? Or is that
Yeah.
really-
Well, for me, all of my board meetings and like finance committee and facilities committee meetings for my school district are on Mondays. And they're all late afternoon. So getting to the regular commission meeting in person is doable. And then I have to beeline right out of there and get back to Virgins. But if we also make committee meetings on Mondays, if they are on the second and third Mondays, in any case, that's going to be difficult for me.
Okay, thank you.
I'm interested in a discussion around the frequency of meetings. Again, if we're looking at, and I think I'll speak for myself as a school board member, I'd love to know where this conversation is headed in November. So that we have some chance to incorporate some stuff into our budgeting process. That doesn't, if we're meeting once a month, given the conversation we just had about all the information we need to inform, so I wonder whether a doodle poll would work for all of us, so we don't have to limit ourselves necessarily to Mondays, but we could adopt a more aggressive schedule for the next couple months than perhaps the other committee meetings, just knowing the stakes are what they are.
Okay,
We've
I
got
would-
recommendations by January.
okay, so I hear a call for more aggressive meetings. I hear a call for maybe in person, but there's some logistics on some Mondays for Elizabeth. So why don't I think doodle polls are sort of a nightmare. And I understand they're necessary sometimes. I'm wondering if we could pick our next meeting now so we could be on a more aggressive schedule and then we can doodle for what a regular meeting would look like. Because I know how slow some of us are on our turnaround on doodle polls, and I imagine that would mean we'd be scheduling further out. So I might be one of the people who's slow to respond to a doodle poll. Not blaming any of you. So I'm wondering, is the 16th one of those days that doesn't work for you, Elizabeth, or does work for you?
On the 16th, I have a finance committee meeting in Virgins that begins at 4:50 p.m. And if I'm talking about coming to Montpelier, it probably would take me at least an hour to get back here. So that puts me.
If we did
Yeah.
like 10 to 1 on the 16th,
That would work. I have a 2.
I cannot do that. I'm in
Okay.
a full day meeting
Great.
in Lake Maury.
okay.
Tuesday.
Who says okay.
Monday, Tuesday that week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday that week, I'm in Lake Maury at a work retreat, unfortunately.
Okay, I'm gonna try this one more time and then I'm gonna give up and go to the doodle poll.
Yeah.
Okay, just say, you don't have to say your yeses, just say no if it's a no. The 23rd at 10 a.m.
Nope. Sorry.
Nope, no need to apologize.
What about the 19th or the 20th? Anybody?
20th I can do.
20th at 10 a.m. Any
I can
no's?
do- Yeah,
The agency can't do that.
Okay, great. Okay, I give up. We're gonna do the poll and you're all great.
This is tough.
It is what it is. And once we pick a regular meeting, we can schedule around it. So I think with that,
Answer quickly on the doodle, folks.
yes, please.
And I
'cause
think
it's
we
like-
are required to do hybrid. Do I have that right? So even if someone can't come in person, we would have the option to join remotely, even if most of us could be there.
Right.
If that helps.
I think it does. Yeah. Okay, with that, I think we have a plan for what our next meeting is. Though we don't have a plan for when our next meeting is. And I hope that's reassuring to some of the data folks who might have to do a lot of work for our next meeting, that we don't know what our next meeting is. And with that, I'm going to do a last round of public participation before we wrap up. Is there anyone from the public who would like to share their thoughts? I see no hands up. I'm going to give it one more moment. Okay. It seems that there's no one. On our next agenda, we'll be clear on sort of how many minutes will be available for public participation for each person who participates so that folks can sort of prepare their testimony. And if folks want to share anything with our working group, is the best bet for them to email it to Maureen? Is that the logistical spot for that? Okay, great. And then is there a website for this where people could get more information?
Yes, there is a section on the agency's website for the Commission on Future Public Education.
Okay, great, thanks. And that's where like all of our meeting notes and stuff will be posted.
Correct.
Love that. Okay, thank you. Anything else before we all say goodbye? This is so great. So good to see all of you. Okay, thanks. See you soon. Doodle poll coming soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Now I gotta figure out how to get out of here.